Hello there and welcome. In this video I'm going to be doing something I haven't done in a long time, and that is a tank setup. But not any ordinary tank setup. I thought I'd challenge myself to using this 1 gallon jar. Now there's lots of different types of pico reef aquariums, so I thought I'd also do something slightly different, and in this jar we're going to be planting it. That's right, planting it. So rather than using corals, I'm going to be using macroalgae, something I'm very passionate about. So obviously lighting is a very important part of any reef tank, however small, and I've gone for the Luxbird Par 38 LED light. I got this one off of Amazon, and the reason I chose this one in particular was because it's a full spectrum light. And this means it'll give off the complete spectrum that the macroalgae are going to need to grow. Also, it's only 18 watts, which is pretty low power. I have used a long pendant I bought from Amazon to suspend it above the jar. Now when we look at the actual light itself, you can see it has lots of different colours of LED. And it's these different colours which give you the full spectrum for your reef tank. I'm going to be using a healthy depth of sand bed in this small jar. Not everybody chooses to use sand in pico reefs or even in their large reefs, but I'm going to be using them because I've always used sand beds and I find them very useful to act as a filtration source, especially in this where there's limited surface area of live rock. The sand itself I'm getting from my mature reef system. It's been running for over a year now, and you can see how mature and live this sand is. So it should minimise any need of cycling this aquarium at all, and it should stop the tank from going cloudy. So I'll just pour it into the jar, obviously not making a mess as best as possible. This sand's very reluctant to come out of this glass, a little bit of an airlock, but if there's one thing I learned from being a kid, it's how to get ketchup from out of a jar, and the same method works well with sand. So I just want to tidy this up a little bit, give it a slight shake and a wiggle to get a nice flat surface, and then we'll carry on. Here you can see a lot of the things that have come within the sand, some spaghetti worms and other little creatures. Onto the aquascapey part of this build. I'm going to be adding some dry ocean rock to this jar, and this was one of the hardest things to find in this build due to the limited size of the jar itself, but also because the opening of the jar is so small. However, I found this piece and it fits perfectly. The rock's a pretty important part of any reef tank because it's where all the bacteria and goodies are going to be living that help keep the entire system stable. In this tank, obviously we're limited in size for any kind of filtration, so the rock as well as the sand is where the main filtration is going to happen. Also, it gives me a nice shape to play with and a great place to be putting my macroalgaes onto. Just experimenting with the design here, and I think the larger rock looks really good in the back right hand side corner. I'm just going to add a small accent stone to the front left, which will give me a little bit of an offset to the large rock, but also give me somewhere else to add some more macroalgae. Here are the different macroalgaes I've selected for this build. I'm lucky enough to have a wide array of different macroalgaes growing in my systems to choose from. And it's actually really difficult to just whittle them down to 6 species, but I have to be selective because it would just look like a pick and mix store if I added too many. Another thing I've had to consider is the fact that some macroalgaes like to grow over and outcompete other species. So I've selected some algae which I know will be okay in this small environment and won't outcompete each other as well, but also offering lots of different textures and shapes for this jar. I'll go through these algae in a bit more detail in a minute, but before that I need to install the small aerator, which is going to provide the main flow within this small jar. Now on to the exciting part, which is actually adding the algae to my rock and setting up the scape ready to put it into the jar itself. So the first macroalgae we're looking at is this one, called green Octo or green Gracilaria. I like to call it green bush algae. This is a very nice macroalgae and one that you don't see very often at all. This one grows in a very wiry, dense bush-like structure, but has very low needs in terms of care. It can grow under most lighting, and I haven't found a way of killing it yet. But that being said, it's not an invasive algae and stays where you put it. I'm going to be attaching this algae to the small accent stone, and to do this I'm going to be using super glue. Super glue is a very safe way of attaching most macroalgaes to pretty much anything. Another way that you can attach algae to rock is actually just to jam them into the rockwork. However, on certain builds you're not going to be able to do that. There's probably not going to be a hole available for you, so super glue is an alternative that you can use. Just be aware that some species of macroalgaes, more in particular the softer kinds, so like Cryptonemia species and things like that, they don't really like being attached and can sometimes die from the attachment site. So you've got to be very selective as to the algae that you attach with the super glue. The next macroalgae we are attaching to this rock, and this is going to be the real centerpiece macroalgae, is a lovely red burgundy macroalgae called Cryptonemia crenulata. This is a fairly hard one to get hold of. It's not sold very often, especially in the UK, but I find it is probably one of the easier red macroalgaes to grow in pretty much any situation. It grows in a really weird way because leaves just grow from other leaves, and it seems to look a little bit disorganised. However, it is actually pretty hardy and is going to be an ideal bright red centerpiece for this little jar. Now the way I'm going to attach this is similar to the other algae I've just done, and that's using super glue, because this one is also tolerant of being glued into place. However, if you leave it long enough, if you've jammed it into a rock hole, then it will end up growing these buds, and that is the holdfast growing, and it will happily attach itself over time to the rock that you jam it into. Next up is one of the very few blue macroalgaes available on the market, and it is becoming more frequently sold and available and easier to get hold of than it used to be. Blue Octodes grows in a very bushy but fragile structure and is easily broken and fragmented. This can be a problem because these little fragments can actually grow into full-size macroalgaes themselves, so it can be considered an invasive species in some reef aquariums. However, it's going to be ideal in this little pico reef just to give us a little bit of variation in structure and colour. One of the good things about blue Octodes is it attaches to rockwork very quickly, within 24 hours in some cases, so I shouldn't need a lot of super glue to hold this in place. Remaining algae are better off being put into the jar when the jar is full and the rocks are in place. So we're going to go ahead and fill this jar up with water from my main system, so nice and mature water. And I'm also going to go ahead and place the rocks into position now. Time for a more common species of macroalgae, and this is one that some people would probably consider very invasive, and that is Caulerpa. However, this particular species of Caulerpa is Caulerpa peltata. It's one of the smaller, and I would consider it a dwarf Caulerpa. It grows in a very similar way to all other Caulerpas. However, this one seems to grow quite slowly and doesn't seem to be as invasive as its larger versions, such as Caulerpa racemosa. I'm going to use this one at the front right to fill in that gap of sand and also create a nice bed of short macroalgae. This one should be easy to trim and keep under control within the system. Next up is a real favourite of mine and of a lot of people's, and that is Caulerpa prolifera. If you have had or going to have a seahorse aquarium, you're probably going to be putting some of this into it. It is a wonderful, tall, grass-like macroalgae which is non-invasive and loves to just grow along the sandbed. The benefit of this macroalgae is due to the fact that it is very hardy and easy to grow, but also doesn't overgrow your corals or anything within your aquarium and just sticks to where you put it. It's also very easy to trim. I'm going to be adding this macroalgae in the back left corner, and this is going to give me some nice height to this build and fill in the gap where there isn't anything else. All you have to do to plant this macroalgae is put the runner beneath the sandbed and the algae will do the rest. Simple. And finally we are adding another dark green macroalgae just to add a little bit of different texture and shape, and that is called Codium, or otherwise known as dead man's fingers. This particular algae doesn't really attach to anything, you just place it wherever you want, and it doesn't even need a lot of light. I think it actually prefers more of a shaded area. And because of this, it's a very slow grower. At the moment, the area that it's in, i.e. in my shed, is very warm, so for the minute I'm just going to be leaving this jar unheated, but I have found this small nano heater to go into the jar when the temperatures start to fall. Because this jar is only 1 gallon, there isn't much in terms of livestock that I can actually add to it. However, I am going to add 2 dove snails to this little system just to keep the algae down and just to put something in there that's going to graze on any hair algae that appears. Dove snails are perfect for this because they are tiny and don't have much in the way of needs or bioload. The last thing to do is put the lid on and then start the air pump. I'm really pleased with how this build turned out.